When I was in college, I was on a mission trip. I was actually a student at the University of North Texas. I was a young believer in Jesus Christ. So I just came to know Christ as my Savior. And the college ministry that I was a part of was going to take a mission trip to Mexico. And so I signed up for this mission trip to Mexico. So as I headed to Mexico, we drove from the Dallas-Fort Worth area all the way through San Antonio, keep on traveling, and you get to a city called Laredo, Texas. So we pulled over, the bus pulls over, and the bus driver says, hey, we need to refuel, and you guys can take an hour, go get something to eat, go get some snacks, and so we did that. So while we were walking around the streets of Laredo, I remember specifically making a few statements to the people with me. I said to myself, and I said to them, I said, who in their right mind would ever live in Laredo, Texas? And the reason why I said that is because you get out of the bus, it's hot. Laredo has this heat that just like this desert heat. It is hot. And then you look and everything is drab. The colors are just brown. And there's like, man, who would live here? And then there's truckers. Remember, like, all the truckers going back and forth across the border? So there's a certain smell of, like, diesel fuel in the air. And then you look across and you see this fence, and then you look across and there's the Rio Grande, and then there's Mexico. And it's like, man, who would in the right mind would ever live here? And then I made this statement, man, I would never live in Laredo, Texas. So I got back on the bus. We went to Mexico. We went into Mexico. We went to a little small village called Saltillo. Beautiful little community. And then we traveled into the big city of Monterrey. You like how I say that, Monterrey? And we had a great time. And it was during that time when I was in Mexico that I really sensed the Lord was stirring in me to go into full-time ministry and to seek after Him. So we drive back and we pass through Laredo and head back past San Antonio and get to Denton, Texas, and then my life goes on as normal. So I graduate college, much like many of these students have no idea where the Lord is leading me. And I meet my wife, Elizabeth. We meet in college, and so I'm trying to just find a job. So at that time, I was part-time youth pastor. I was also a cafeteria manager at high school in Carrollton, Texas, and I was attending seminary. And I was young married, and then shortly after found out that we have a baby on the way. So like my life changed dramatically within a year. So during this time, God was stirring in my spirit to come to San Antonio. And so I put out this letter of interest to, this was way before you know, the internet and all that kind of stuff where you can connect with people. So I wrote a letter and I mailed it. Some of you young people don't know what that is. But we mailed out a number of letters to different churches, 3 of them in San Antonio, 1 of them in Fredericksburg, and 1 in Laredo, Texas. And out of all the places, out of all the people that responded, it was Laredo. Laredo called me up. And the reason why I put that letter of interest was because the pastor there was a seminary grad from the seminary that I was going to. So I felt like, okay, we have some kind of connection there. So he immediately calls me. He doesn't like write a letter. He calls me. And he says, will you come to Laredo? And I'm thinking, in the back of my mind, I entertained it, and I said, well, I'd have to go visit. I've been there. But I told him, I said, my wife would have to go and sign off on it because her heart's San Antonio. And so we ended up driving. They actually flew us to meet the church and to put us through an interviewing process. And to my surprise, Elizabeth loved it. And I was like, are you sure? I was like, it's hot in Laredo. So we ended up taking the job in Laredo, Texas, and we were there for 5.5 years. And some of you who know me, I will share this with you. that it was some of the hardest years of my life, the first 3 years there. There were times I would come home and I would just tell Elizabeth, I said, man, I don't know if I can continue to work here. Church ministry is tough, I would tell her. I said, working with teenagers is tough. Working with their parents is even more tough. And just being a young pastor, didn't know what I was doing, going to seminary, and I was just trying to navigate all these things. And so there were so many times I just wanted to cut and run, just say, we're moving. I don't know, I don't care what we're going to do, we're just going to go do something else. And then I kept remembering that God said, I want you in Laredo. And I was like, oh. So I stuck it out. And as I look back on my life, those were some of the best years of my life, even though they're the hardest years of my life. And the reason why is because God was reshaping me. He was sanding away a lot of things that didn't need to be there. And so he was growing me as a young pastor, and I didn't realize it. I wanted the easy way out. And he was like, no, I'm preparing you for your next stage of life. So sometimes we go through hard times, and we want to shortcut the process. But maybe God is letting us go through some things in our life so that he might grow us and mature us so that we might be ready for that next stage in life, whatever that might be. And so we ended up staying there 5.5 years. And again, if the Lord called me back to go to Laredo, Texas, I'd go in a heartbeat. It's a tough place to live, especially back when we were there in the late 90s. There was no Christian radio on because we didn't have internet streams and all that kind of stuff, dial up back in those days. No Christian bookstores. I mean, it was a tough place. No Starbucks. I mean, it was like a tough place. But it's very modern now, and I would go. So now what I say often is, Lord, whatever you do, please do not send me to Hawaii. I will never live in Hawaii, Lord. Never, never, never. Just to see if he'll send me. So this morning, as we continue our sermon series, if you've been with us, we are going through a sermon series called Gone Fishing. And we are looking at some life lessons from a disciple called Peter. Now, I love Peter, and hopefully you do too, because Peter reminds me of myself and should remind you of yourself. He's just an average guy. And yet the Lord's going to use him in some mighty ways. But along this discipleship training that he's going to go through for 3 years, it's going to be tough. And so today we're going to find out about Peter having to get his feet wet. We sang about it earlier in Oceans. We know the story about him walking on water. So this is what we're going to look at this morning in the narrative. So let's take a look at Matthew 14 this morning. Matthew 14:22 says this, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. Now, let me give you a little framework of the context of what's happening here in the narrative. So if you were to look in your Bibles, right before this, you see that Jesus has fed the 5,000. Right before that, we find out that John the Baptizer has been killed. So John the Baptist is beheaded, and his head is actually brought on a platter to Herod. And the disciples go, John's disciples, the followers of John, they go and they grab his body, and they give him a burial. And then they go tell Jesus what happened to John. And the scripture tells us that Jesus, this is interesting, Jesus gets into a boat and he separates himself from the crowd and he has some solitude time. We don't know what he's doing in the boat, but he is alone in the boat. And then after that, when he comes to shore, there is this large crowd of people, 5,000 plus. The narrative actually tells us it's 5,000 men plus women plus children. So there's probably 6,000 people there waiting for him at the shore. So here he is, solitude time, because he is reflecting and thinking about his friend John the Baptist, and now he finds himself face to face with the crowds. And the crowds are not there to offer support. They're not there to offer their condolences. They're not there to say, Jesus, we heard about your friend John, and we think it was a bad thing, and we're praying for you. They didn't offer any of that. What they wanted was, what can you do for me, Jesus? So they show up with some agenda that you, Jesus, we've already heard that you've been casting out demons. We've heard that you have been healing the sick people. And now you're on this shore. We've been looking for you, Jesus, and we want something from you, Jesus. And so Jesus now begins to minister to these people, and then all of a sudden the disciples look up and they say, Jesus, it's getting really late. Send these people away. They need to go home to get some food. And Jesus says, you feed them. And so you know how the story goes where they take 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus blesses it, and it's a miracle, and he feeds the 5,000 plus people. So this is the context of what's taken place. And then now notice in verse 22, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. And while he dismissed the crowd, and after he had dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. Now, we don't know why Jesus does this, but clearly he's separating the 2 groups. The crowds are there for one reason only. They want something from Jesus. Free food? I'm there. You going to heal me? I'm there. But there's a group there also, the disciples, that have committed to following Jesus for good times, bad times, for better, for worse. We're in this together, Jesus. We're going to follow you. We want to learn from you. And so Jesus puts his disciples, we don't know who these disciples are, but he puts these disciples in a boat, just like he was earlier, and he sends them away. And then he looks at the crowd, and he's like, okay, nothing to see. No more miracles. No more free food. You guys have got what you wanted. Go home now. And so he dismisses them, and then he himself now doesn't get in the boat with the disciples, but he himself goes onto the mountain, it says, by himself, and he goes to pray. We don't know what he's praying for. I can have a couple of ideas looking at the narrative that perhaps he's praying for the crowd, maybe that they will truly come to follow him, not for the free food and not for what can you do for me, Jesus, but they would truly come to know that I am the Messiah, the one that came to seek and save which was lost. And maybe he's praying for the disciples because he is on the mountain and he has a perspective that they don't have because he is actually seeing the winds pick up. Now, if these are fishermen, which I believe they are, because we'll find out that one of them is Peter, if these are, in fact, James and John and Andrew and Peter, then they have spent majority of their life on the water. That's their strength. They have been in boats most of their life. They know exactly what to do when they're out on the sea. So it's interesting that he puts them in a boat and he sends them out into the water. Now, it's important for you to remember because they didn't get into the boat voluntarily. It was Jesus' idea. Get in the boat and go on out. Now, let's follow the narrative. Verse 24 says this. But the boat was already a considerable distance from the land. It was buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. One of the other gospel accounts, I believe it's in the book of John, mentions that these disciples were sitting there rowing and rowing and rowing and rowing and rowing, and they could not get to the other side. But the winds were so strong, they were just in place. And so here we find out that Jesus Christ puts them in a situation that's going to be a very tough situation for them. My experience in Laredo, maybe some of you will be able to relate with this in your own life journey, but sometimes when you go through trials in your life, it's because God himself is correcting you, like a parent does a child. So when my kids do something wrong, as a loving parent, I correct their behavior. If they say something that's inappropriate, I correct their behavior. If they do something that's inappropriate, I correct their behavior because I love them. If I didn't love them, I would just let them just do whatever you want to do. But that's not the case. A loving father corrects their children. And they don't just give them the things that they need and sometimes the things they want, but they also discipline them. They train them to walk the right path in life. But in the spiritual realm, sometimes we are like rebellious children and we do what we want to do. And we make some choices that often have some consequences attached to them. And you know what we often do? After we have made those choices with the real consequences, we get mad at God. God, why did you let this happen to me? And God's like, wait, you did that. And if you have problems in your life, we often blame God. The scripture makes it very clear that it is the devil who comes to seek, kill, and destroy. God comes to give you life and give it more abundantly. And so when our life is falling apart from the bad decisions that we make and we have real consequences, we should not run from God. We should run to God. Because even in those midst of circumstances, God can correct us and get us back on track, and He can use those hard times for a life lesson so we don't do it again. I follow a young man. We have mutual friends, and I know him from an acquaintance, but I follow this young man on social media, and he is living right now in another state. And he has recently been posting some things that are really sad. Just a lot of posts that he feels like everyone's against him. He feels like his coworkers are against him. He feels like even his family is against him. He feels like everyone is against him. He feels like the church is against him. But I know his family, and I know his family loves him. Now, I don't know his coworkers, and I don't know what church he's going to. He lives in California, and so, but I've seen previous posts that he is actually getting caught up with the lifestyle of what goes on in L.A. And so now he's got all these problems that are coming down on himself. And I can only think that God is going to use that to correct his behavior, to get him back on track, to following the truth. God can use a trial also to mature us. I believe that that's what he did for me in Laredo. That's what he's doing for Peter in this boat. My daughter Isabella, so some of y'all know that I'm new for the first time having two kids play softball and t-ball. And so my life has just gone crazy with like practice, game, practice, game. So my daughter, Isabella, right before the season starts, literally like a week before the season starts, she breaks her ankle. She has never played t-ball. So some of these kids start off when they're 4, and they play at 5, and they play at 6, and they play at 7. So at tryouts, she shows up, and it's very clear these kids have been playing for a long time. And so she's up there, and she's just timid in the tryouts. And I'm like, Bella, I know you can do better than this. But she's never played. So right before the season starts, I'm thinking to myself, man, she's going to have a hard time this year. Then she breaks her ankle, so she can't play like the first 4 weeks. She can't practice. She can't do anything. So I'm thinking in the back of my mind, she's going to show up. These kids have been playing since they're 4. She's 8. And so now she's going to start 4 weeks after the season, and she's going to be even more behind. So, again, selfish, I'll admit it. She's not practicing because she's got a broken leg. So I'm like, I'm not taking you to practice. I mean, you're just going to sit there. And then I'm thinking in the back of my mind, but maybe that would benefit. I'll practice with you at home one-on-one. So at home, we're practicing catch, good job, catch, throw, good job. Basic stuff, swing. She's got a cast on. She can't really do much. So I'd say, let's go to watch some of your games. So we go and we sit in the stands. And so we're on the stands and we're in the front row. And like the first couple of games of her season, she doesn't even know any of the teammates. She doesn't know her coach. She's just there. But she's on the team, but she's not part of it because she can't play. So we're sitting there, and I'm like, Bella, I want you to watch what's going on. And so I'm telling her, I said, Bella, look, when that ball's hit, that person does this, and that person's going to throw there, and that person's going to do this and that. And I look over at her, and she's playing in the sand. Dad, it's hot. Dad, I want a snow cone. I'm like, Bella, you're going to get into this team. These girls have been playing since they're 4. You're 8. They got 4 years of experience on you. You're 4 weeks behind. You're going to get into a live situation. You don't know where to throw to. You don't even know which base to run. You never played this game. You don't know what you're doing. Bella, pay attention. I want a snow cone, Dad. Let's go, Bella. Let's just go. Okay, let's go home. Can we stop and get a snow cone? I'm like, oh. We get to, her cast comes off. We get to the first game that she gets to play. The coach puts her behind home plate. I mean, at that age, I get it, But she's never played on the thing before, and she can't even walk. This thing, helmet's like this, and the shin guards, and she's like... So I'm behind home plate. I'm like, Bella. And I'm coaching her from behind the Bella, and that person's like doing the score, looking at me like I'm crazy. I'm like, Bella, okay, so you're going to cover home plate. If that ball's coming, you're going to, and she's like, what's home plate, And I'm like, you shouldn't have been like, you playing in the sand. Now you got to know what's going on here. So after a few innings, they put her in the outfield. And then I find myself in the outfield. And I'm like, Bella. I'm like, trying to be discreet. If they hit you the ball, you're going to just stop it. Just whatever you do, just knock it down. And throw it to the second baseman. And so, sure enough, ball hit to where she's at. And she fields it clean, comes up throwing, throws the second base. And I'm just like, yes, you're the best ever. You're going to be an all-star. You're like incredible. So you're saying, Pastor, what does that have to do with Peter? As a dad, I knew what she was about to get into. And I was going to do everything I could to try to prepare her for that day. And that would be the same true for my oldest. That would be the same true for my youngest. Whatever I can do to help prepare them for their next step in life, I'm going to do it because I care for them. Jesus Christ knows the big picture. Jesus Christ knows that he is going to be with them for 3 years. He knows that he is about to leave. He knows that once he leaves them, they will be all alone. They will have the Holy Spirit, but they will endure persecution because of him. And he's like, guys, it's discipleship time. It's training time. You have got to get ready. I'm going to put you in a situation that you think you're strong because you know the water. You are fishermen. But in reality, when all your things that you have put your strength in come crumbling down, you're not going to have anything else to hold on to except for me. And so here we find out in verse 25, during the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went out to them. So the previous little section of Scripture said it was the evening. The 4th watch is like 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. These guys have been out on the boat all night, and the waves are just pounding and pounding and pounding and pounding. They're tired. They can't get to the other side. Think about if you've ever been on like boats that are in a storm. Think about this. They are in a boat, and they're probably just getting pounced with water. And it's just like their eyes are just burning because of this salt water, and they are just being, bombarded by all this water. So verse 26, when the disciples saw, during the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. Verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. Have you ever seen anybody walk on water? If you were out in the middle of the boat and the waves were hitting you and you were tired and it was 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning and you see somebody walking on water, what would you say? You would freak out. You would say the exact same things. You would think it's a ghost. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." They hear the words of Jesus, and I truly believe that we, the sheep, know the shepherd's voice. And they hear the words of Jesus. But Peter says this. He says, Lord, if it is you, tell me to come out into the water. Now, some of you have been deep sea fishing and the waves are crazy. How many of you would volunteer to come get out into the water? I wouldn't. Where's my safety? In the boat. But Peter, for whatever reason, gets up and he says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out on the water. Verse 29, Jesus said, come. Then Peter got down out of the boat and he walked on water. And he came towards Jesus. Only 2 people in history have ever walked on water. Jesus and Peter. Now, I'm glad that the next verse we're about to see, I'm glad it's here. Because verse 30 says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, beginning to sink. He cried out, Lord, save me. See, if verse 30 is not there, we begin to elevate Peter. We begin to think that he is just like Jesus. In fact, Jesus resurrects from the grave, correct? But you know Lazarus resurrects from the grave? I've heard people say, well, Jesus is not that special because Lazarus resurrected too. Lazarus later on dies again. Jesus doesn't. He ascends into glory. So we have to be careful because when we see God do miracles through people, then we begin to elevate those people. Look how awesome Peter is. Peter walks on water. Jesus walks on water. But you see Peter? I know Peter. Peter walks on water. But no, that's not how the narrative goes. It says, but when he saw the wind, he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he begins to sink. Verse 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and he caught him. And he says this, you of little faith. And I have no idea what that next part of that verse says. Does anybody have it on their thing? Why did you doubt? Thank you. It's a bad thing about PowerPoint. You of little faith. I used to read this and I used to think, okay, he's being picked on, you of little faith. And now I'm starting to look at him like, no, he's actually tested him. And he's saying, okay, this is your test. You got to see. You need to improve. He was testing them to know what the future is going to hold. And so, it's during these times, these hard times, guys, that we will all face. That it can grow your faith. None of us in this room will ever walk on water. None of us in this room will ever look at the waves and just take our eyes off of Jesus and begin to sink. That narrative will never, ever happen again, and not to us. But here's the honest truth. You will be put in situations by Jesus to grow you, to mature you. When you get into those situations, here's the key. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Because if you begin to take your eyes off of Jesus and you begin to look at the circumstances or situations, you'll do just like Peter. You have little faith. You begin to sink. Whatever you're going through, guys, and we know this, life is tough. But keep your eyes on Jesus. And when you go through these trials, guys, it often encourages others. Verse 32 says, when he and Jesus climbed into the boat, the wind dies down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him. Truly you are the Son of God. Not only does this test prepare Peter for the future, but it also helps encourage these other men who are in the boat. So what about us, guys? So what's our next step? Maybe some of you this morning are the crowd. Maybe some of you show up to church every Sunday, whether it's this local assembly or another local assembly and you show up with a mindset is, what can you do for me, Jesus? That's a lot of the belief system that's taken place in our culture today, is that we have this kind of mentality that if we entertain you, then you will come. And some of it can be good. God can always use these things to get us, but it will never keep us. In college, you have a lot of ministries that give away free food. And what does that do? It brings the college students over. There's nothing wrong with that if you want to attract them. But if you want to keep them long term, you're going to have to keep feeding them. And after a while, that's going to get old because they're just crowd mindset. What do you have for me? In the local church, we do the same thing. We come to church with the mindset is, what can you do for me? And that's part of it. But if you're not in the crowd, then the next group is the disciples. And the disciples say, Jesus, I need you. That's what I really need, Jesus. I need you. And if I have the free food, and if I have the healing, and if I have all these other things, that's just part of it. But what I really need the most is you. So we have to ask ourselves this morning, are we part of the crowd? Do we just show up and what do you have for me, Jesus? Or do we show up now with a mindset that I want to follow you, Jesus? I want to follow you. Even if you take me through storms in life and I go kicking and screaming, Lord, I want to follow you. And maybe it's just for us, some of us in here, the very last part of that passage we read is that they worshiped him. Maybe some of us this morning just need to reprioritize our thinking, our mind, and we need to make time to worship him. And I'm not talking just about Sunday morning, I'm talking about in your days. So, as we will see through the next several weeks going through the summer, Peter's going to be tested a lot more in various ways. They're going to go through a midst time of persecution. What if the Lord is preparing us for a time of persecution? Would you agree with me that the day has changed, the times have changed? Now that we have what's called social media, we hear a lot of people's ideas and thoughts that we never thought they had. And we start elevating things that years ago we never thought would have been elevated. We see the value of life. But what if now the values have changed a little bit and we begin to value animal life over human life? And you see the conversations that are sparked on social media about this gorilla that was shot and killed. And clearly no one wants to put an animal down. I mean, I've had to put pets down, and it's very hard. And I would assume putting down a gorilla would be a very hard thing to do. But there's been this subtle shift in our thinking that all of a sudden now we're elevating animal life over this life of this 4-year-old. If my 4-year-old falls in there, whether it's my fault or not, protect the kid. Why are we going to go on to this craziness of like valuing the gorilla over the child? And we're just scratching the surface of things are being backwards in our thinking. And social media, I believe, is a good thing, but I believe it also has become an outlet for us to alter our values, our biblical view, and things are backwards. And what if the church is asleep? And I'm not talking about some of you who are tired. I realize it gets warm in here. And if you do fall asleep in church, it's okay. You know why? Peter falls asleep when he's supposed to be praying with Jesus. So if you need to take a nap, this is the only time out of the week you get a nap, then God will be honored, I guess. Because Jesus said, can't you stay awake, Peter, for just 1 hour? He was sleeping. Some of you are sleeping. But what if the church is asleep? And what if we're so programmed? By the way, I saw this on social media. That's what TV is called, a program, when you watch a program. And TV has slowly been programming our thinking for generations. Social media now is the new platform to program our thinking. Everything we see on the news is programmed. It's not just random. What are the news outlets that we need to be covering? It is programmed so that way you think a certain way and you behave a certain way. And what if the United States that we know of in the next 5-10 years is not the United States that we grew up in? And what if the freedoms that we have today are gone because they are freedoms that have been granted to us by God? But what if we've taken God out of the picture? And what if we follow the ways of the world? And what if we find ourselves one day in that slow cooker that we've been slowly being programmed to think a certain way, and we realize all of a sudden that the world is against us because we're Christians? Would you still follow? There's brothers and sisters all over the world right now that are being put in those situations. They're not part of the crowd. They are followers of Christ. They are disciples of Christ. They want to follow him. And my hope for us here at Vista Community Church is that we individually will want to follow him.